There once was a man who had dreams of becoming a teacher or a policeman, but somehow he fell into rugby league. Although he was pretty small, he trained really hard, became pretty good pretty quickly. It wasn't long before he'd climbed the ranks of the NRL. He had an exciting and successful career of 267 professional games, was involved in winning a premiership, he won the Dally M medal, and even got to sit next to the Queen. Although he'd never been to war, he realised that playing for an elite sporting team was like being in a band of brothers who go into battle every weekend. He quickly learnt that like any band of brothers, you're really only as strong as your weakest link, which can be a problem for all concerned if you're the one with a problem. You see, his league career was going along really well. He was at the peak of his game. But everything began to change with the arrival of a new coach who decided to shake things up by changing his position, a position he had excelled in. It was not the coach's fault, but this was a complete disaster for our player. This simple change was the tipping point of his downward spiral. He became very unhappy, and this unhappiness began to affect his performance. As his performance declined, so did his game time. Before he knew it, he'd been dropped to reserve grade. His biggest concern was that he was letting his family down who'd been so supportive of him. He feared that he'd no longer be able to support them. He became very angry and blamed a lot of people for his situation. Part of the problem was he wasn't telling anyone how he was feeling. When you get into crisis and you're not taking care or responsibility for yourself, things can fall apart really quickly. He started taking his frustration, anger and sadness out onto the field. He started taking unnecessary risks and took some big hits as a result. He got into his first proper fight during a match, which was very unlike him, and it just made him feel worse. He began to feel like he wasn't part of the team, and yet put a lot of energy into projecting normalcy at the club. On the inside, it was a very different story. He concealed a vast emptiness, a deep pit that he couldn't tell anyone about. At home, he removed the facade and the darkness came out. A sullen moodiness permeated his home, and this affected everyone. He became like a ghost to his family. He was there, but not really there. This darkness had become all-consuming. One day, his wife and family up and left. Everyone and everything he'd been playing league for was gone. How did this happen? Thinking he needed some company, he went and got a dog, but it was no match for his black dog. One day, driving home from training, he shouted, "Bugger it," and in a moment of complete anger and despair, he swerved off the road and into a tree. He totaled his car and smashed himself up pretty bad. When he came to in the rescue helicopter, he said he'd fallen asleep at the wheel. The sad thing was, he had this massive war going on in his head, and no one was the wiser. He was not only good at league, but was surprisingly good at acting. After the accident, lots of people offered all sorts of help, but like a good footy player, he deflected it all. But in all honesty, he needed that help so badly. Eventually, that help came in the form of his coach, who asked him to go for a drive in his car. The coach didn't tell him where they were going, and not much was said during the drive. They came to a building where he was announced to the front desk. The next thing he knew, he was in a psychologist's office, and for the first time in a very long time, he really began to talk openly. And then he began to cry. Initially, he felt ashamed, but it was also like air being released from an overinflated tyre. It was a huge relief for him to talk, to unburden his troubles, to be heard, and not to be told that he was weak, a failure, or a fraud. The psychologist just listened without judgment. She showed him how distorted his thinking had become, and that everything that had happened was not all his fault. She gave him tools to look at things in a different light. he began to discover he had many reasons to move forward. It was painful, it was insightful, it was incredibly cathartic. He learnt to accept that there are aspects of his life that he could change and others that he couldn't. He began to take responsibility for himself. He began to really talk to the important people in his life. Throughout all of this, he kept thinking, why did it take all of what had happened just to simply talk about it? He felt a little foolish, but more importantly, he was incredibly relieved. His distorted thinking had led him to believe the truth would be his undoing, so he stifled it. In the end, it was the truth that set him free. He suffered so unnecessarily, but thankfully his coach had put two and two together and saved his life. This story is by no means unique. It's not an easy story for anyone to live or to tell, but it does have a good ending. With the right help and the right support, our footy player got back on the field. He got back into the team, he got back with his family, and he got back into life. He drew two very strong morals from this story. A tough guy doesn't talk about his issues. A stronger man does. And to really help yourself, you have to learn how to ask for it.
Hey, I'm Preston Campbell, and if you didn't already know, that was my story. The NRL reflects Australian society. We have people from all cultures and backgrounds. Mental health issues don't discriminate. It doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, or how much money you have. It affects all people across the board. But the good news is, everyone can be helped. So if you can relate to any of my story, don't do what I did. Get help, be helped, and always hold on to hope.